Então, gente, novamente, muito obrigada. Thank you, Becky, for coming. And, well, you may begin as last time.
Yes. Would you like me to just talk? Do you have The Good Wife here? The Good Wife, the television show?
Yeah.
Yes, with Josh Charles in it? The guy who plays Tom? I don't know, maybe you haven't seen it. It was a series, a TV series that ran for 7 years. It just ended, called The Good Wife. While I had seen Josh Charles in a lot of other things, movies, when he was young, he was in the Dead Poets Society movie with Robin Williams. Yeah. And he was just a kid then, and he's known more for television than for movies. He was in different series. Aaron Sorkin, who's a great writer who did West Wing and many other series, did an early series called Sports Night. He was in that. He was in Treatment, which was an American HBO series. And there's something about him that intrigues me. I think there's a deep internal life for Josh as an actor, and that's what I was looking for when I was looking to see who would play this psychologist, this man who's also carrying a secret, and that secret possibly compromises his mission to find the truth, that his mission to find the truth is compromised by a past and an agenda that could sway the outcome. So I don't know if that resonates for you guys. The story is based on a book. The book is by a British author named Pat Barker. She is very well known, award-winning author, taught in our universities, but most known for a series of books called Regeneration Trilogy about World War I and about PTSD. Is that a word that people here know? It's post-traumatic stress syndrome. Yeah. And she wrote about it before there were those letters, PTSD. She wrote about it very early on. And this book, Border Crossing, was a different kind of a book for her. One that I happened to be, somebody gave it to me, this book, after something really horrible happened in my life. My oldest friend from college was murdered by her 19-year-old son. And I watched the kid grow up. He was a good kid, he loved his mother, and I was devastated. But I wanted an explanation for how this could happen. I said, there has to be a reason. And my friend who is a psychologist, gave me this book to read, which I read page to page really quickly, but it didn't give me that answer. In fact, it was really a kind of question-asking book, but it helped me to understand something very basic or fundamental, is that we as a culture are very interested, we're fascinated and we're horrified by this dark side of human nature. We read about it, we consume it in our television, whether it's comic books like the Joker from Batman or Darth Vader, or all the ways in which we're obsessed by killers and serial killers, that there's an element that we're both horrified and fascinated by, and I just came to understand that there is that element in all of us. There's a Jekyll and Hyde, there's a kind of libidinal and a rational, and these two characters play with this idea of the struggle between these two sides, but ultimately I think that anyone can step across a line, a border, a boundary. The name of the book was Border Crossing, but I changed the title at the end because all of the commercial people involved in the film thought in the United States the word border means Mexico and Texas. So, no, and when we'd ask people, what do you think border crossing is about? They would all say, oh, it's about immigration, Mexico, Texas, or immigration now, even borders. So we changed the name. It took us a long time, because when you fall in love with something, it's hard to ever change a name, but we eventually did. But in my head, the movie is still called Border Crossing, which is the name of Pat Barker's book. And it was a very long labor for me. About also, all my films take about 5 years. So this event happened, I read the book, and worked on a screenplay for at least 2 years. It's very hard to adapt a book to a screenplay, because the author has the ability to tell you what is in the head of all the characters, or a character. And she can also speak in her author's voice to tell you things. But a movie is based on behavior. So you have to figure out how to turn psychology into action. We have an expression in making movies called show, don't tell. And we have to find ways in which to make the story driven by behavior. So it was a hard adaptation. When you love a book, it's even harder to adapt it to a screenplay. And I really loved the book, and she was so philosophical, and for her writing, it's often what's not said that's so interesting. And so I took everything I could from the book and left some things out and added. There are things in my movie that are not in the book. I won't tell you what yet, but we worked on it to try to, and also Tom in the book is a slightly more passive character. He absorbs things, and we hear his thoughts, and he goes back more into his past about having been a child and having pushed a young boy into the water and almost watched him drown. A story you hear at the very end when he re-meets Danny in the house that he killed the woman in. And so we find out more in the book than we do in the movie. And yet I needed an active character. There's nothing worse for drama than a character who's passive. We say that it's the enemy of a director is to have a character who's passive. So I had to work a lot with his want and moving him forward, and this desire to prove that maybe he was right. He hopes he was right. And all the while, he's actually fighting against himself, because the guilt and suspicion that he might have done the wrong thing is haunting him. He almost becomes obsessed, like a detective, a maniacal detective obsessed in search of the answer to a question, or like Oedipus in search of, who killed his mother. So that search, of course, drives him forward, and it helped me to get him to be more active rather than passive. And the actor himself, Josh, worked with me. We would meet a couple of times a week. Once I cast him, we would get together on 8th Street in this restaurant that we really liked, and we went through the script even after, I locked the draft, but he came in and worked to find ways of activating Tom's want. So because the danger is that you have an antagonist, right? An antagonist who is so dazzling. The antagonist is a ghost. He is in every scene, even when he's not. So the protagonist has to come up to the level of the antagonist. So it's a struggle again. It's a morality, it's a murky morality, but it's between the rational and the libidinal, the social and the animal side of everybody. It's a father-son story as well. So that's all my blah, blah, blah. I hope you got it. I mean, as Esther and I were saying, this is a psychological thriller, and I was really intent on making it as tight as I possibly could, that I wanted a very tight and this feeling of claustrophobia. And when I shot my scenes, I always shot dirty shots. You know what a dirty shot is? When two people are talking, I am in Pat's frame, that there's a part of the person not speaking or not who the camera is not on, invading the space of the other character. So, and using long lenses, which are lenses that compress space, and making it look more filmic, because everybody who knows me knows how much I despise digital HD and all of that, because I grew up with film. I did everything I could to kind of make the image tighter and more film-like in softer, not hard edge, but soft edge, to add to my psychological thriller. But at the same time as I'm trying to make it a psychological thriller, there's a story I need to tell, and the story involves really a kind of character study. So I think I was handling a lot all at the same time. If it's just a drama, you don't so much have to worry about the tension. And if it's a psychological thriller, without deeper questions, although thrillers and film noir usually have, I think, the underside, the unconscious is really a big part of those stories when you think about things like Double Indemnity or Out of the Past or all of the noirs and some of the thrillers. You are asking questions, so balancing those two things can be quite difficult. So that was part of my work as a director, is to find out how to do that.
I think it's great that, of course, all thrillers and suspense films have the dark side there, but the dark side is masked, or and in this case it's subtle because the dark side is not masked.
Yes.
So it's a thriller, but it's not an action film.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's it deals with the
psyche, the human, and the human condition.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have to keep it moving forward. So, yeah, it was a really tough call, but so intriguing, on so many levels that I lost myself in it. And also the haunting for me was the story of my friend, and there's not a day that goes by where I don't think about that and haunted by. And when I went to visit her son, really maybe about a week, maybe 2 weeks after it happened, he was put in Rikers Island, which is a terrible prison, and he was evaluated, and then they put him into a psychiatric Bellevue hospital. And I said to myself, okay, I need to see this kid. I have to face him with right in front of him. And I think that my friend would have even forgiven him for all of that as well, horrifyingly. But the first thing he said to me when I walked into Bellevue, and you have to go through all the metal detectors, and I sat down at a table facing him, and he looked terrible, and the first thing he said to me was, "I didn't do it." And that line, you hear Danny say, "I didn't do it, I didn't do it." But of course, Danny is much more of a con artist, is much more of a manipulator than I think Henry was. Although Henry posed as the most charming, the beautiful smile. It's the smile that gets me, the smile of Henry, the real character in my life, and Danny's smile is just so seductive that, even when you begin to think that Danny probably did it, you want to be able to forgive him because, it's like he finds a way, and I think you're fighting that as an audience, which is great because you become really bonded, to the film, and you keep wanting to think, okay, it's gonna be fine, right? Like we want things more or less to have that track, but then things aren't fine. And there is this element of evil. I have to say, I just showed the film in Warsaw, in Poland, and I was talking about it like this to the audience, and all of a sudden I stopped and I said, it's not just people that have that dark side, that evil, which can't even be explained, let alone treated by a psychiatrist. And I just thought for a minute, a whole country was complicit with the extermination of the Jews. And and I didn't say that, but I looked at them all and I said, and countries are also, and of course I'm generalizing, but when you go along with evil, you become the thing that you're denying in a way.
Alguém quer perguntar? Não, vou fazer uma pergunta. Your characters. I would like to two questions. One is related to soundtrack, because I love the way, because this kind of film, it's so important to, in order to build the trick, the situation.
Yes.
And you don't use it too much. How you discuss with the musicians? How do you plan your soundtrack? And
Yeah.
the conception of it, that is so important in this kind of film.
Yes, it's true. I think the sound design is really always important in film, and I think it's even yet another layer that you add to meaning as you add a really designed sound. I work with some of the best people in the business. They're my friends, thank God. Skip Levsey, who just won an Academy Award for Gravity, and Eugene Garrity, who worked on all of Scorsese's films in Ang Lee. So I have my team, and we talk a lot about how to add layers for character, for story, sounds that don't exist that you create sometimes. You create a tone, a mood. I mean, the sounds for The Drowning actually were really fantastic because the score, and this is always a problem, the music is also the same guy who did Handsome Harry, Anton Sanko, who's a really fantastic sound designer. So you're working with music, but you're also working with sound design, and I love them both. And you can't let one overrule the other, or sometimes you can. You could just use pure sound design, and that is music. But I was always balancing those two things, and I do love that post-production moment when you're making a film allows you to kind of almost reconceive of the story again, but as does editing, but this time, from the other side, from the side in which you kind of are trying to pinpoint certain things. Like when Danny is on the road, he's disappeared. He said, pull over, I gotta take a leak. And Tom gets out of the car, beginning to worry, and we know that Danny is not exactly safe. He's just tried to get himself rearrested in jail. And as Tom walks, all of a sudden, a car goes by. And the car going by, is heightened. It's the sound of like a truck. And we played it big, and then all of a sudden Danny comes out of the woods and taps him on the shoulder, and we subtly use a kind of a whoosh sound like that, but how loud to make it or how subtle, like we spent hours playing with the volume of just that, like that kind of sound hit right at that moment, because you want it to work on you I want it to work on the viewer so that you're not thinking about it, but you're feeling it, which is the trick of all filmmaking. That style is important, and your decisions with camera and everything is important, but you don't want it to supersede everything else. You want it to be part of the texture of the film itself so that it works all together. Although there are some films that are out there, I probably like them less, that shout out, look how cool I am, I'm going to move the camera all over the place. Like those films eventually bore me. I'm a huge fan of Sidney Lumet, Dog Day Afternoon, Prince of the Cities, so many great movies that he directed, and he was so subtle in his use of camera that it was so much a part of the fabric of the story and didn't have to kind of show off like I think maybe a lot of films today do, more than they used to. Sound and music. Yeah.
And the other question is related to the change of the main character, because it's incredible also having this.
Yes, you mean Tom, the character.
Yes.
Yeah. So what about that? He does start off, he's a pro, he's good at what he does, he's been doing it for years, and he's invested in having answers, as the psychological community is there in order to provide answers for behavior. So to meet somebody who you can't apply that professionalism to is daunting, and yet, as I said before, he has doubt. So we all have doubt in our lives. How many times have you had doubt about a decision you made or an action that you took? And so doubt is a pretty powerful force, and I think the combination of the two things that are driving or eating at him push him to keep going farther than, the question is, why doesn't he just walk away? Well, the moment that he lets the kid into his house is the first moment of trespass, of what a psychiatrist is never supposed to do, which is allow a patient to enter their private lives. So there's the first border there. And it seems like such an innocent moment, and yet it's full of danger, and yet he knows it, and Danny also struggles to win Tom over as well. So I think it's just an interesting struggle, and to get that change was really
And he felt
important.
guilty.
Yeah.
The guilt is it's the
Yes.
the main.
Yeah, and
feeling.
he's guilt that maybe he did the wrong thing, but he keeps saying he didn't do the wrong. Like everyone said, no, you did the right thing. So how do you work on that as an actor? He was brilliant. He really kept that that battle alive in himself, in his eyes and underneath, and you see the very subtle things he does, I think, as an actor, to show you how he is gradually becoming Danny. And I remember it started off saying to each actor, there's a little bit of Tom and Danny, and there's a little bit of Danny and Tom. And, you guys have to find out what part of that there is in you. And it was just fun to work on. And Julia Stiles' character as Tom's wife, easily in a kind of more traditional film, could have been minimized and made not powerful, that she could have been the quote-unquote victim. And Julia and I worked really hard to give her her own secret, and her secret is her ambition. And she doesn't allow herself to be brought down. She wants to be with Tom. She doesn't need to be with Tom. So I think the triangle of these three, plus the other characters, make for just a really riveting battle between different forces that we all have in us. And we struggle with these, whether you're aware of it or not, and you're sometimes more aware than others in your life. But the idea that it is possible, I mean, we wouldn't have this obsession with dark, evil characters if we didn't feel that if we didn't suspect or even have this sort of implicit understanding that we're there too. I think that horrified, fascinating position is really so delightfully torturing that I'm obsessed with it myself. and just probing the dark side of human nature, it becomes a little bit scary. And the more we find out, I think the more we try to look beneath to get answers that may never be gotten. Like the water, people have asked me, well, you use water, you have it at the beginning, 3 drownings, and I said, yes, that's because the water has a surface, and then when you go down underneath the surface of the water, it gets darker. Remember, like, if you're swimming underneath the ocean, so the unconscious is so manifested for me in water and the ocean and the depth and the darkness that lies below. So I just, really think it's subject matter that can never really truly be exhausted. There's so much to say.
Would you mind to talk about Angela's character?
Yes.
Because I feel that lack of in your speech about Angela.
Yes, so Angela is a parole officer,
Yeah.
which means when somebody gets out of prison, they're assigned an officer who has to keep them looking for work and keep them focused. It's kind of like a social worker, but not. It's a more in the system of the law, the legal system. So she's meant to guide him, and yet even she becomes somewhat taken by this young boy. She, like the psychiatrist, she's a little bit prone to giving him more than she should. It's suggested that, was there a sexual relationship? There wasn't, but you see that she wants to believe in him as the school teacher from the scene when he was in juvenile detention, which is, we have these places where young people go until they're old enough to be sent to jail. And even there, the headmistress of the school says, Danny had this ability. He was a dark hole. He could take you in until, before you know it, before you realized it, you were taken in by him. Or the other, the guy Angus, who was a teacher also at that school, who says Danny thinks, you know, that he's the victim, but he's not the victim. That all of these other characters can see something in Danny that's both attractive and yet difficult. And so there are people along the way who have also been affected. But in Angela's case, she's trying to hold together for him, and yet she could be slipping. And
Yeah.
it's a warning to Tom.
Yeah.
It's a warning to Tom. He sees it, he goes, Angela, what's going on? He's your patient, right? Like so often I know we give advice to other people saying, what are you doing? Can't you see? And meanwhile, you're just as vulnerable to the same things that we criticize other people for. So I don't know, I mean, in the book, of course, her character is even different and maybe more present in the book, but you can't put everything from the book
No.
into the movie, so maybe she suffered a little bit. But actually in the book, Tom gets together with the parole officer, Martha. Her name is Martha in the book. And they somehow join forces. And in the book, Danny walks away at the end. And Pat Barker has more hope than I do. The book doesn't end anything like my movie does. She has a lot more hope, even though she plays with this lack of a explanation. And she said that Tom is complicit. He slowly, it's a story of a good man who becomes complicit with evil. I take that even farther to say he has it in him. And the past, of course, of Tom is even more prominent in the book than the movie. But it's interesting what you take and what you leave. And the scene with the chicken was not at all in the book. It's described that Danny's father forced him to do these things, but in trying to kind of make behavior more powerful than words, we added a scene. My second writer, who is the head writer for House of Cards, the TV series, was very good with imagining things. He said, we need to see that scene, but in this scene we're going to have Danny make Tom do it, because he goes, you're a tourist, right? You help other people, but you don't ever feel anything. How do you think it feels? And he makes him feel that. That was not in the book at all. So we created that,
It's the strongest scene.
Yeah, and we made it up. But of course, that's right. I mean, the book inspired us, to get there. It's such a kind of, it was a scene that, it's funny, often you'll ask directors, what was the most difficult scene? What were you afraid of? In you directing something, what scared you the most that you were having trouble to tackle? And that was the scene, the chicken scene. I said, oh my God, how am I going to do this, logistics aside? And it turns out always that the hardest scene becomes the scene you love the best, the one that you struggled with, or that you weren't sure, and how far, and what should I show, and all of that. It often becomes the scene that you love the most. And I do love that scene. And it's also had to be the scene in which we said with Josh and Tom character, at this moment, he confesses, albeit not a real confession, and that you then believe that that confession is that he's taking responsibility. What psychiatrists always want you to take responsibility for action. So he takes responsibility. And that at that moment, Tom buys in. He goes, okay, I'm going to fight for this kid, and I'm going to fight against the father. Little does he know that Danny invited the father in, and he says, my father knows I'm here. And the father gets out of the car, and he said, who do you think called me? So it's the orchestration again, but even then I'm not sure Tom believes it. And not until the very end when Rowena appears do we really, like in some audiences I watch with, at that moment when she comes in again and she's at the university, the audience goes like that, you know, and I always like those moments of an intake of breath, or like a moment when something is about to happen and you can't have that experience alone, but when you have it together in a group, in a theater, it's always great. Yeah, so.
Well,
Thank you for coming.
no, one
Oh,
more.
okay.
Yeah. I'd like to listen from you about your career.
Oh, okay.
Because you have done some experimental films, and as you said, this is your more
Commercial, classic, yeah.
classic film. And how do you move from one way to another, or do you think there is an evolution or evolution or movement that you...
Yeah, it's funny, like a lot of my friends say, why don't you make some of those short films you used to make? I don't think I could anymore. It was an
Yes.
evolution. I came from a world of film that was very intriguing in the art world at the time, and I was studying and taking classes, and I was an experimental filmmaker. I was always interested in the material of film, like for a painter it would be the paint on the canvas. For me it was time and space, and using film as an art form, although my other, let's say, role models or people who were making experimental film, Michael Snow, structuralist, or the experimental, I never liked the Brackage group. I always liked more rigorous, tough experimental films, but I always realized that I was also drawn to narrative. So my film Michigan Avenue has a beginning, middle, and an end, but nothing in between. You know, I was always drawn to more towards story than I realized. And as I began to grow as an experimental filmmaker, and I made a lot of shorts, and they started getting invited places, then I said, okay, let me make a film that's going to be almost a long experimental film called Empty Suitcases, which was almost a 60-minute film that was very experimental, but also narrative. The story of a woman who travels back and forth between two places, and she can't decide where to stay. And I used indecision as my sort of starting off point, as that indecision somehow for me represented displacement. This was the women's movement. It was 1980, the end of the 70s, and this idea of women in language, women in culture. And so I never used one actress to be in the film because I never had one. So every time I thought up another scene, I kind of made it as I went along. I would get one of my friends or a student or somebody and say, will you be in my scene? You know, and then I would do the scene. And so then I put them all together. So there was never any main character except for she, meaning any woman, all women, a woman, just to fill that role of the protagonist. And so I made Empty Suitcases, really toying with narrative, but not quite there yet. And it was invited to the Berlin Film Festival, where I met my first big producer, German television. At the time, German TV was really producing a lot of independent films all over the world, but specifically in the United States. Stranger Than Paradise, my film Variety, Charlie Ahern Wild Style, a lot of films. And it was a great revelation for us because unlike other countries that have funding for you guys to, you know, you can apply, we don't have that. The arts grants are so minuscule, you know, that you can't make a film on them. So having German TV as a huge supporter was something that allowed me to cross over. And even yet, I don't know, Variety is a narrative feature, but still plays a lot with visual image. I think you can see over the course of my work, going from the short form to the longer form through Variety, that it is definitely an evolution. And my love of story was always there as a kid. There's nothing I liked more than my father's bedtime stories about a little mischievous kid who couldn't have gotten into more trouble than he got into. So in a way, I think my journey took me through a moment in history when we were deconstructing everything, taking everything apart. And over the course of my time as a filmmaker, I've used that deconstruction, but now I'm just constructing, making stories, and really investing in character in a way that I don't think I did early on because I wasn't interested And it was fun to do what I did, but I couldn't do it anymore. Isn't that funny? I mean, I would not even have the faintest or vaguest idea of how to make what I made then now. I don't even know if I would have the interest. And I know even at Columbia, we have somebody coming in to teach an experimental film class. They're going to show, you know, like some brackage and snow and some of the 1960s and 70s. And I just said, are anybody going to be interested in that? I mean, isn't the world so different to that now? I said, we'll see if that language of filmmaking really has, you know, a grounding in today's world. Maybe it does. Maybe what I saw a lot of my friends from those days doing was using the experimental film language to go into commercials, making these really beautiful, elaborate commercials with some of the devices that they had kind of used as experimental filmmakers. And yeah, I don't know. But I know that I'm driven more towards, it's definitely story, but really character and human nature, and this question that haunts me perpetually about whether one can ever escape the past. In this film particularly, are you born evil? Are you, that's something that you develop? What about these boundaries? Have we all crossed boundaries? What kind of boundaries are there in our lives? So I love those questions. You know, I think the day that I stop asking questions is a bad day for me. Like, it's always more interesting to ask the questions than to find the answers, I think. It's a motto that I've lived by.
From the underground to the ground.
And now, some more questions. I don't know, do you have any questions? So,
Thank you.
yes, thank you,
Yeah,
thank you,
thank you.